The biting wind of a freezing Tuesday afternoon whipped against my face as the taxi pulled away, leaving me standing at the bottom of our driveway. Every single step sent a dull, throbbing ache through my pelvis. My body was still battered, recovering from a brutal, complicated labor just 2 days ago. I could barely walk upright, but I pushed through the physical pain, ignoring the exhaustion settling deep into my bones. All my focus, all my remaining strength was dedicated to the tiny, fragile weight strapped tightly to my chest inside my oversized military parka. My newborn daughter Zara let out a soft, sleepy sigh against my collarbone. "We're home, baby girl," I whispered, pulling the coat a little tighter around her. "Mama's got you." I looked up at the beautiful 2-story craftsman house. It was supposed to be our forever home. After aging out of the foster system and spending my entire adult life bouncing between military barracks and deployments, this house represented the safe harbor I had desperately craved. I pictured the nursery upstairs. I had spent months painting it a soft lavender, meticulously assembling the crib while my husband Marcus worked late at the office. I imagined him inside right now. I imagined him dropping whatever he was doing, rushing to the front door and taking my heavy military duffel bag so I could finally rest. I pushed my key into the brass lock. The heavy oak door swung open, and I stepped out of the biting winter snow and into the foyer. I expected the familiar, comforting scent of cinnamon candles and cedar wood. I expected warmth. Instead, I stepped into a suffocating, icy silence. "Marcus," I called out, my voice cracking slightly from the dry hospital air. I unlaced my snow boots with trembling fingers and walked slowly into the living room. The space was immaculately clean, completely untouched by the chaotic, beautiful mess of bringing a new baby home. And then I saw them. Marcus was standing near the stone fireplace. He didn't rush toward me. He didn't even look at his newborn daughter. His arm was wrapped securely, intimately around the waist of another woman. I blinked, my exhausted post-labor brain struggling to process the scene unfolding in my own living room. It was Chloe. She was Marcus's wealthy older boss from the tech firm. She was wearing a perfectly tailored cashmere coat, her designer heels sinking into my rug. But it wasn't just the two of them standing there in this twisted embrace. Chloe was holding a baby. My heart stuttered in my chest. The silence in the room grew heavy, thick with a reality I simply could not comprehend. I stood there shivering in my damp coat, clutching my duffel bag in one hand and supporting Zara's fragile head with the other. The smell of Chloe's expensive floral perfume hung in the air, masking the scent of my home. "Marcus," I breathed, my heart hammering against my ribs. "What is going on? Whose baby is that?" He didn't flinch. He didn't offer a frantic explanation or pull his arm away from Chloe's waist. He didn't show an ounce of guilt. Instead, a slow, calculated smirk spread across his handsome face. He looked at me as if I were a stranger who had just interrupted a private party. He reached over to the glass coffee table, picked up a thick, bound stack of legal documents, and tossed them carelessly. They landed with a sharp, heavy slap against the glass. "Divorce papers," Marcus said, his voice completely devoid of the warmth I had known for 3 years. "Sign them." The words echoed in the quiet room. They didn't make sense. None of this made sense. "Are you insane?" I choked out, taking a shaky step forward. "I just gave birth to our daughter. I just left the hospital. What kind of sick joke is this?" Chloe adjusted the baby in her arms, looking me up and down with an expression of absolute unvarnished distaste. She looked at me like I was a stain on her shoe. "It's not a joke, Maya," Chloe said smoothly, her voice dripping with condescension. "Marcus is simply moving on to a life that actually fits him. A life with real resources, stability, and a family that belongs in this tax bracket, not a charity case playing house." Before I could even process the sheer, breathtaking cruelty of her words, the swinging door to the kitchen flew open. My mother-in-law Brenda marched into the living room. She was drying her hands on one of my monogrammed dish towels. For a brief, naive second, my chest flooded with relief. I thought she would intervene. I thought she would scream at Marcus for bringing his mistress into our home, for doing this to the mother of his child. But Brenda didn't even look at her son. She marched straight toward me, her face flushed with righteous anger. "Don't just stand there tracking dirty snow onto the hardwood," Brenda snapped, pointing a trembling manicured finger directly at the front door. "Take your child and get out of our house." "Your house," I gasped, my grip tightening instinctively around Zara. "Brenda, what are you talking about? My military signing bonus paid the down payment on this house. And my son pays the mortgage," she screamed, taking a step closer, her eyes flashing with a deep historical resentment. "You have always been a burden, Maya. A complete embarrassment to this family." The historical gaslighting hit me like a physical blow. The years of quiet insults were finally being dragged out into the light. "I told Marcus from the very beginning that a woman dragging around military baggage and an unladylike attitude wouldn't make a proper wife." Brenda spat, glancing admiringly at Chloe before turning her glare back to me. "You have no pedigree, no connections. Look at you. You can't even offer him the professional network Chloe can. You are nothing but a dead weight pulling my boy down." I stared at Brenda, the woman I had desperately tried to call Mom for 3 years. I had endured her constant microaggressions about my natural hair. I had smiled through her snide remarks that my engineering career in the service was too masculine. I had cooked her holiday dinners and bought her expensive gifts, hoping to earn a fraction of the love she showered on her golden son. She wasn't just defending his infidelity, she had actively helped orchestrate it. She had welcomed his mistress into my home while I was in a hospital bed pushing out her granddaughter. "You're kicking me out?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous, terrifyingly calm register. "Into the freezing snow, with a 2-day-old infant. My body is bleeding, Brenda. I have nowhere to go." Marcus stepped forward, dropping his arm from Chloe's waist just long enough to point at the legal papers on the table. The smirk on his face deepened into something deeply sinister. "You have no legal right to this property, Maya," Marcus stated coldly. "I filed the deed under an LLC 3 months ago. You have exactly 2 minutes to leave before I call the police and tell them a disgruntled, unstable military veteran is trespassing and threatening my new family." My own husband was threatening to call the cops on me. He was going to use my veteran status, the very service that had paid for the roof over his head, to paint me as a threat. My military training, dormant for the past year of civilian life, suddenly roared awake. Panic is a luxury you cannot afford in a combat zone. And this beautifully decorated living room had just become a hostile battlefield. The betrayal was total. It was absolute. But I refused to let them see me break. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I didn't fall to my knees and plead for my marriage. I looked at the three of them, the man who had vowed to protect me, the mother-in-law who had plotted my ruin, and the wealthy mistress who believed she could simply buy my life. "I am leaving," I said, my voice eerily steady, even as my hands shook with a potent mix of fear and pure adrenaline. "But understand this, Marcus. You will regret this day." I turned on my heel, grabbed the handle of my heavy duffel bag, and walked out the front door. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind me. The deadbolt clicked into place with a sharp final sound, the sound of my old life ending. The biting cold hit me immediately, stinging my tear-stained cheeks and stealing the breath from my lungs. The sun was beginning to set, casting long gray shadows across the pristine, snow-covered lawns of the wealthy suburban neighborhood. I had absolutely nowhere to go. My bank cards were tied to Marcus's accounts, which meant he could track or freeze them at any moment. The only cash I had to my name was a folded emergency $50 bill hidden deep in my wallet. I began to walk. I put one heavy foot in front of the other, focusing solely on keeping Zara warm against my chest. Every step sent a sharp spike of pain through my healing body. The icy wind cut brutally through my jeans, stinging my legs, but I kept my posture rigidly straight. I knew Brenda and Marcus were likely watching me from the living room window, waiting for me to stumble. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction. I marched down the icy suburban sidewalk, passing beautifully lit houses with families eating dinner inside. The contrast between their warmth and my sudden violent homelessness was suffocating. I walked until my house, the house I had paid for, the house I had loved, was completely out of sight. My snow boots crunched loudly as I finally reached a small covered bus stop at the far edge of the neighborhood. The metal bench was coated in a thin, unforgiving layer of ice. I couldn't sit down. The pain in my body was too intense and the cold would seep right through me. I stood shivering under the plastic shelter, swaying gently from side to side to keep Zara calm. She let out a soft mewling cry, shifting her tiny weight against my chest. "I've got you, baby," I whispered, my teeth chattering so violently I could barely form the words. "Mama's got you. You're safe. I promise." Realizing the cold was beginning to seep through the seams of my military coat, I knelt awkwardly on the freezing concrete. I unzipped my duffel bag with stiff, frozen fingers. I frantically dug past my hospital discharge papers, past a few rolled-up maternity shirts, searching desperately for the thick wool receiving blanket I had packed. As I shoved my hand deep into the side pocket of the canvas bag, my frozen fingers brushed against something hard and plastic. I paused, frowning. It didn't feel like a baby bottle or a phone charger. I pulled my hand out of the dark pocket and opened my palm. It was a sleek, heavy-duty encrypted flash drive. My heart stopped dead in my chest. I recognized it instantly. It was the exact flash drive Marcus had been tearing the house apart looking for just 3 days ago. I remembered the scene vividly. It was the night my water broke. I had been leaning against the kitchen counter, breathing through intense contractions, while Marcus tore through the home office like a madman. He had been sweating, pulling out drawers, throwing papers onto the floor, completely frantic. He had screamed at me that his entire career, his entire future depended on finding this specific drive before his morning meeting with Chloe. He never found it. In the chaos of the ambulance arriving, it must have somehow been knocked off the desk and fallen directly into the open side pocket of my hospital bag. I stared at the small black device resting heavily in my trembling palm. The wind howled around the bus stop, but I barely felt the cold anymore. Marcus thought he had stripped me of everything. He thought he had left me powerless, penniless, and broken in the snow. But as I stared at the encrypted drive, a slow-burning realization began to spread through my chest. I wasn't just a discarded wife holding a baby. I was holding the one thing he valued more than his own family. The neon vacancy sign outside the Starlight Motel flickered violently in the wind, casting a sickly, intermittent red glow across the cracked asphalt. It was miles away from the manicured lawns and secure gates of my old neighborhood, sitting quietly in the forgotten industrial outskirts of the city. I stood at the night window, my teeth chattering as I slid my emergency $50 bill under the scratched, bulletproof glass. The clerk, a man with tired eyes and a heavy woolen jacket, didn't ask questions. He didn't ask why a woman in an oversized military parka clutching a newborn to her chest was renting a room at 9 o'clock on a freezing Tuesday night. He simply took the cash and slid a heavy brass key back through the metal slot. Room 114 smelled of stale tobacco and cheap industrial pine cleaner. I locked the flimsy wooden door behind me, immediately sliding the tarnished security chain into its track. The room was bitter cold, the chill radiating from the single uninsulated window. I laid Zara gently in the center of the sagging mattress, keeping her tightly bundled in my coat, and rushed to the ancient wall heater. I twisted the cracked plastic dial as far as it would go. The machine coughed, rattled aggressively against the drywall, and finally began to spit out a meager, dusty stream of lukewarm air. I sat awkwardly on the edge of the bed, pulling my knees to my chest. The sheer adrenaline that had carried me through the biting snow was finally wearing off, leaving behind a profound physical agony. Every muscle in my body throbbed. My pelvis ached with a dull, heavy reminder that I had just pushed a life into the world barely 48 hours ago. I was bleeding, exhausted, and running on fumes. I looked down at my sleeping daughter. Her tiny chest rose and fell in a steady, peaceful rhythm. She had absolutely no idea that her entire world, the beautiful lavender nursery and the warm home I had built for her, had just been violently stolen. My hands shook as I reached into my canvas bag and pulled out the encrypted flash drive. I turned the small piece of hard black plastic over in my palm. It felt incredibly heavy. As the rattling of his heater faded into the background, my exhausted mind pulled me backward, forcing me to confront the polished lies that had trapped me. I remembered walking into a downtown coffee shop 3 years ago, fresh out of my final military deployment, still struggling to adjust to the quiet civilian world. I had no living family to return to. Having aged out of the foster care system before enlisting the military barracks had been the only real home I had ever known. I was disciplined, tough, and fiercely independent, but beneath the armor I harbored a quiet, desperate craving for a safe harbor. I just wanted a family to call my own. Marcus had recognized that vulnerability the second we met. He played the role of the charming, protective harbor with terrifying perfection. He listened intently to my stories, held my hand through the lingering, sleepless nights of my PTSD, and promised me a life of permanent warmth and stability. I was so starved for belonging that I willingly put on blinders. I desperately wanted the fairy tale, so I ignored the subtle, insidious red flags that were planted the very first day I met his mother. Brenda had never wanted me in her son's life. Sitting in the cold motel, the historical gaslighting crashed over me, no longer clouded by my desperate need for her maternal approval. I remembered our very first Thanksgiving dinner together. She had reached across the dining table, her manicured fingers hovering just inches from my natural hair, and sighed heavily. She told me it looked so difficult and unkempt to manage, suggesting a chemical straightener would make me look much more professional, more like a proper presentable wife for a rising corporate star. When I proudly mentioned my background in military engineering and security, Brenda had simply wrinkled her nose in distaste. She called it unladylike. She constantly reminded me in front of extended family and friends that Marcus was the golden child. He was the brilliant executive destined for greatness, and my rough military edges were a clear liability to his polished future. In her eyes, I was never an equal partner. I was the scapegoat, the charity case they had generously allowed into their pristine, wealthy world. And then there was Chloe. The memory of those excruciating company holiday dinners made my empty stomach turn. I would sit quietly in my modest dresses, while Brenda fawned aggressively over Chloe's wealth. My mother-in-law would practically drool over Chloe's designer handbags and vacation stories, treating the older, wealthy executive far more like a daughter than she ever treated me. Whenever Marcus and Chloe shared a lingering glance or a whispered joke, Brenda would smile approvingly. I had convinced myself it was just corporate networking. I had convinced myself I was just being a jealous, insecure wife. They had been grooming Marcus for this betrayal for years. The signs were woven tightly into every family gathering, every snide comment about my clothes, every dismissive glance when I spoke. They had slowly stripped away my confidence, making me believe I was lucky just to be tolerated in their presence. Sitting in the dim light of the dingy motel room, the crushing despair suddenly burned away, replaced by a slow, methodical anger. It started in my chest and radiated outward, warming my freezing hands. Marcus and Brenda thought I was just a discarded, broken burden. They thought because I didn't come from a legacy of money, because I didn't have a wealthy family to fall back on, that I would simply disappear into the snow and accept my ruin. They expected me to cry, to beg, to fold. They had severely underestimated the discipline of a woman who had survived combat zones far more dangerous than their country club cruelty. I reached deep into the bottom of my heavy duffel bag and pulled out my old battered laptop. It was thick, heavy, and scarred with scratches from my deployments, but the hardware inside was strictly military grade. I plugged the frayed power cord into the loose wall outlet near the nightstand and waited for the familiar, comforting hum of the internal cooling fan. I inserted the flash drive into the port. Immediately, a stark red security prompt appeared on the center of the screen, demanding an administrative password. Marcus had always been arrogant. He believed he was the smartest man in any room he walked into, but he was a corporate suit, not a security engineer. He relied on expensive off-the-shelf commercial encryption protocols to hide his secrets. He thought money bought impenetrable security. My fingers flew across the worn keyboard, muscle memory taking over. I didn't bother using brute force to guess his passwords. I used the advanced decryption training the military had drilled into me for years. I bypassed the standard user interface, entirely opening the command terminal and feeding a series of aggressive bypass scripts directly into the drive's root directory. The motel heater rattled loudly, fighting the freezing draft leaking from the window, but I was sweating. Line after line of bright green code scrolled rapidly down my pitch-black screen. Marcus thought he had locked me out of my own life. He thought he could freeze my bank accounts, throw me into the winter storm, and leave me utterly powerless. He thought a simple commercial password would keep his entire life safe from the woman he called a dead weight. The progress bar on my screen hit 100%. The red security prompt vanished instantly, replaced by a sudden cascade of unlocked hidden folders. I leaned closer to the glowing screen, my heart hammering violently against my ribs as I opened the master file labeled Project Apex. My eyes scanned the digital documents, the complex software blueprints, and the highly sensitive encrypted financial transfers. The sheer magnitude of the information was breathtaking. It wasn't just office gossip, it wasn't just financial records of his affair. I was looking at thousands of pages of massive, irrefutable corporate espionage. Marcus and Chloe hadn't just been sleeping together. They had been systematically stealing highly classified defense contracts and proprietary code from Chloe's largest, most powerful tech rival. Morning light crept through the gap in the motel's blackout curtains, casting a harsh gray beam across the stained carpet. I sat on the edge of the sagging bed, my eyes burning from a completely sleepless night. The cheap, rattling wall heater barely fought back the freezing draft. My battered laptop was tucked safely back into the bottom of my military duffel bag, but the glowing lines of stolen code were permanently burned into my memory. I knew exactly what Marcus had done to his company. I had the undeniable proof of his corporate espionage. But bringing him to justice was a long, strategic game, and I had an infant who needed a warm, safe home today. I looked down at Zara. She was wrapped tightly in my scratchy wool blanket, her tiny chest rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm. I stroked her soft, warm cheek with the back of my thumb, feeling a fierce, protective ache in my chest. "We are getting out of here, little one," I whispered into the quiet room. "Mama promises." I carefully bundled her against my chest, zipping my heavy parka up as far as the zipper would go. Every movement sent a sharp, agonizing spike of pain through my pelvis, a brutal reminder that I had given birth less than 3 days ago. My body was screaming for rest, but I forced the pain into a small locked box in my mind. Survival simply didn't care about my recovery time. I had a solid, rational plan. Marcus and I shared a joint savings account at the downtown bank. We had built it together over 3 long years, pooling my military deployment bonuses with his executive salary. There was nearly $90,000 sitting in that account. Legally, half of it was mine. All I needed to do was withdraw my rightful share. $45,000 was more than enough to hire a ruthless divorce attorney, put down a solid deposit on a secure apartment, and buy Zara a proper crib. I drove my freezing car across town, the heater desperately struggling to defrost the icy windshield. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I pulled into the parking lot of our bank branch, staring at the familiar glass doors. They felt like a gateway to my freedom. The inside of the bank was quiet and wonderfully warm, smelling faintly of coffee and expensive floor wax. I stood in the teller line, swaying gently from side to side to keep Zara asleep against my chest. When the next available teller waved me over, I offered a polite, exhausted smile. "Good morning," I said, sliding my driver's license and debit card across the polished marble counter. "I need to withdraw funds from my joint savings account. I would like a cashier's check for $45,000, please." The young teller smiled brightly back and began typing on her keyboard. A few seconds passed. Her bright smile faltered. She squinted at her monitor, hit the backspace key aggressively, and typed the numbers in again. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Vance," she said, her brow furrowed in genuine confusion. "Are you absolutely sure this is the right account number?" "Yes," I replied, a cold, sharp prickle of anxiety forming in the pit of my stomach. "It's the premier joint account under Marcus and Maya Vance." She bit her lip, looking incredibly uncomfortable as she glanced from the screen to my face. "Ma'am, the available balance in this account is 0. The warm air in the quiet lobby suddenly felt thick and suffocating. My ears began to ring. "That's impossible," I said, my voice rising just a fraction, echoing slightly in the quiet bank. There was $90,000 in that account on Monday afternoon. Please check it again. The teller shrank back slightly and pressed a button under her desk. Let me get the branch manager for you. A tall, balding man in a sharp gray suit hurried out of a glass-walled office. He recognized me immediately. We had sat in his plush office when we bought our Craftsman house 3 years ago. Maya, Mr. Harrison said, gently lowering his voice as he approached the counter. Why don't we step into my office for a moment? I followed him, my legs feeling heavy and uncooperative. I sat down heavily in a leather guest chair, clutching Zara protectively against my heart. Where is my money, Mr. Harrison? I asked, looking him dead in the eye, refusing to let my fear show. He sighed heavily, folding his hands precisely on his immaculate desk. Maya Marcus came into the branch on Tuesday morning. He executed a wire transfer, moving the entire $90,000 balance of the joint savings into a private offshore LLC account. Because his name was on the primary signature card, he had the absolute legal right to do so without your consent. Tuesday morning. I did the agonizing math in my head. Tuesday morning was exactly when I was lying in a sterile hospital bed in the labor ward. While I was screaming in sheer agony, pushing his daughter into the world, my husband was methodically draining every single penny we owned. Fine, I said, swallowing the bitter bile rising in my throat. I forced my voice to remain steady. Then I need a cash advance on my personal credit line. I have a platinum card with a $30,000 limit. Mr. Harrison looked down at his polished mahogany desk. He couldn't even meet my gaze. I can't do that, Maya. Your credit lines have been completely frozen. Frozen by who? I demanded, the disciplined military composure I relied on beginning to crack. That is my personal line of credit. It is tied exclusively to my social security number. Mr. Harrison pulled a thin manila file from his desk drawer and slid a single officially stamped sheet of paper across the desk. Marcus submitted this emergency medical directive yesterday afternoon. It's signed by a private physician. It states that you have been diagnosed with severe postpartum psychosis. I stared at the black ink on the paper in absolute, unadulterated horror. The directive claims you are a danger to yourself and your finances, he explained quietly, his voice laced with pity. It places an emergency mandatory freeze on all your revolving credit to prevent erratic spending. Until you are formally cleared by a state-appointed psychiatrist, the bank's fraud department automatically locks the accounts. My hands are tied. I am so terribly sorry. The sheer calculated evil of his plan took my breath away. Marcus hadn't just kicked me out into the snow. He had methodically stripped me of every single financial resource I needed to survive. He had weaponized my vulnerable postpartum state against me. He had twisted the beautiful birth of our child into a ruthless tool for my execution. I stood up. My knees shook violently, but I forced my spine straight. I absolutely refused to let this man see me break down and cry. Thank you for your time, Mr. Harrison, I said, my voice completely devoid of any human emotion. I walked out of the manager's office and back into the main lobby. The bright fluorescent lights felt harsh and blinding. People were staring at me. I was entirely penniless. The single crumpled $50 bill in my coat pocket was the only thing standing between my newborn daughter and the freezing winter streets. As I stood near the exit, trying desperately to catch my breath and steady my racing heart, my cell phone buzzed sharply in my coat pocket. I pulled it out with stiff, frozen fingers. It was a text message from my mother-in-law, Brenda. There was no accompanying text message, no context, no explanation, just a single high-resolution photograph. I tapped the cracked screen to load the image. All the air rushed out of my lungs in a painful gasp. It was a picture taken inside my own home, inside the beautiful nursery I had spent weeks carefully painting the perfect shade of soft lavender. Marcus was sitting in the expensive cedar rocking chair I had painstakingly assembled by hand. Chloe was perched comfortably on the armrest, leaning her head affectionately against his shoulder. Her designer cashmere sweater brushed intimately against his chest. And in Marcus's arms, wrapped in a plush, expensive baby blanket, was the child Chloe had brought into my living room yesterday. They were all smiling broadly at the camera. It was a picture-perfect family portrait taken in the very room I had built with my own 2 hands for Zara. The psychological cruelty was perfectly designed. Brenda knew I was out in the biting cold. She knew my accounts were completely drained. She sent this to break my spirit permanently. She wanted me to look at this photo and dissolve into a puddle of helpless, shattered grief in the middle of a bank lobby. She wanted me to realize I had been completely and easily replaced. But Brenda made a critical, fatal mistake. As I stared at the smug, smirking faces of my husband and his wealthy mistress, the crushing despair didn't break me. Instead, it ignited. The suffocating panic evaporated in an instant, replaced by a slow, methodical, burning fury. It settled deep into my chest, hot and terrifyingly calm. They thought I was just a helpless, discarded civilian wife. They forgot they had just declared war on a trained combat veteran. I still had the encrypted flash drive. I had the digital keys to their total corporate destruction sitting quietly in my cheap canvas bag. I locked my phone screen and shoved the device back into my pocket. I adjusted Zara's warm blanket, squared my shoulders, and pushed forcefully through the heavy glass doors of the bank, stepping back out into the biting winter wind. I marched across the icy asphalt parking lot toward my frozen car, my mind already coldly calculating my next tactical move. I needed to leverage the stolen tech. I needed to find a buyer or a powerful ally. Maya Vance. A man's rough voice cut through the howling wind. I stopped in my tracks. A tall man wearing a heavy beige winter coat stepped out from behind a parked delivery van, blocking my direct path to my car door. He didn't look like an immediate physical threat, but my survival instincts flared instantly. "Who's asking?" I said, my voice hard and defensive, shifting my weight to protect the baby strapped to my chest. "I'm a process server for the county," he said, holding out a thick, sealed manila envelope. "You've been officially served." I stared down at the heavy envelope. I didn't reach for it. He stepped forward, placed it gently on the icy hood of my car, and turned around, walking away quickly without another word. The winter wind whipped aggressively at the edges of the envelope. I reached out with a trembling, freezing hand and tore the paper seal open. I pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. They were stamped at the top with the bold red seal of the county family court. My eyes scanned the heavy black text on the first page. It was an emergency court summons, a mandatory legal hearing scheduled for tomorrow morning. Marcus wasn't just divorcing me. He wasn't just bankrupting me. He was suing for full, immediate, and exclusive custody of Zara. The heavy oak doors of the county family courthouse loomed above me like a fortress. I stood on the freezing concrete steps, holding Zara tightly against my chest. I was wearing my only good civilian suit, a simple charcoal gray skirt suit I had bought for job interviews after my military discharge. It felt paper-thin and entirely inadequate against the biting winter wind. I pulled my wool coat tighter around my daughter, shielding her fragile face from the cold. Across the plaza, a sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb. Marcus stepped out first, adjusting the cuffs of a custom-tailored navy suit. He looked well-rested, polished, and perfectly at ease. Chloe followed, draped in a stunning camel-colored wool coat, looking like she had just stepped off a runway. They weren't alone. They were flanked by 3 sharply dressed men holding thick leather briefcases. An entire team of high-priced, aggressive lawyers bought and paid for by Chloe's stolen wealth. They walked past me without a single word. Marcus didn't even glance down at his newborn daughter, sleeping against my chest. He just offered a tight, arrogant smirk as his lead attorney held the heavy brass door open for them. The message was clear. I was outgunned, outmatched, and completely out of my depth. Inside the courtroom was suffocatingly warm. The smell of polished wood and old paper made me feel slightly nauseous. I sat completely alone at the respondent's table. I had no lawyer to whisper advice into my ear. I had no money for a retainer, and the county legal aid office had a waiting list 3 months long. It was just me, a yellow legal pad, and a cheap plastic pen. Across the aisle, Marcus's legal team spread out like an invading army. They organized stacks of pristine folders and whispered confidently to one another. Marcus sat in the center of them, looking like a CEO preparing for a hostile takeover. His lead attorney, a man with silver hair and a booming theatrical voice, wasted absolutely no time. He painted a picture of me that was utterly unrecognizable. He told the judge that I was currently homeless, living out of a cheap motel in my freezing car. He declared me unemployed, financially destitute, and deeply unstable. He conveniently left out the part where Marcus had systematically drained my bank accounts while I was in the hospital. He left out the lock change. He made my sudden poverty sound like a personal moral failure, rather than a calculated execution orchestrated by my own husband. I kept my posture rigidly straight. My military training demanded absolute composure under fire. I didn't interrupt. I didn't shout. I didn't let them see how deeply their words were cutting into me. But my hands shook violently under the heavy wooden table as I listened to a stranger casually destroy my character on the public record. Then the lawyer called my mother-in-law to the stand. Brenda walked up to the witness box wearing a conservative pale blue dress and a delicate pearl necklace. She looked the absolute picture of a concerned, loving, and heartbroken grandmother. The moment she raised her right hand and swore to tell the truth, the performance truly began. "Mrs. Vance, can you describe your daughter-in-law's behavior over the last year?" the lawyer asked, gently treating her as if she might shatter at any moment. Brenda pulled a lace-edged tissue from her purse and dabbed at her perfectly dry eyes. "It has been absolutely terrifying," she whispered, her voice trembling with practiced precision. "Maya has always been unpredictable since she left the military, but recently she became incredibly erratic. She would scream at Marcus for no reason. She would pace the house at all hours of the night, muttering to herself. My jaw tightened so hard my teeth ached. She was taking my struggles with postpartum insomnia and the lingering quiet echoes of my deployments and weaponizing them. "Did you ever fear for your new grandchild's safety?" the lawyer prompted, stepping back to let the courtroom absorb her words. Brenda let out a tragic, shaking sob. She covered her mouth with her hand, playing to the gallery. "Yes, absolutely. Maya has severe military trauma that she refuses to get proper help for. Just days after giving birth, she became completely unhinged. She abandoned her beautiful home. She just packed a duffel bag and dragged that poor, innocent newborn out into a freezing snowstorm. Marcus begged her to stay. I begged her to stay, but she was entirely out of her mind. It was pure, unadulterated perjury. It was a masterclass in gaslighting." I looked up at the judge, a stern-faced man peering over his reading glasses. I could see the subtle shift in his eyes. He was listening to this weeping, respectable grandmother and looking at the stoic, unsmiling veteran sitting alone at the defense table. My disciplined composure, the very thing keeping me from falling apart into a sobbing mess, was actively working against me. To him, I didn't look like a heartbroken, terrified mother. I looked cold. I looked emotionally detached. I looked exactly like the dangerous, unfeeling woman Brenda was describing. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up. My knees felt like water, but I forced myself to present the facts clearly. I told the judge about the drained bank accounts. I explained the sudden lock change and the brutal eviction. I held up my pristine military service record and my honorable discharge as proof of my character and reliability. But I had no hard evidence of the financial theft yet. I didn't have the bank statements to prove the wire transfers. Marcus's lawyer immediately objected to my testimony, loudly calling my claims the paranoid, fabricated delusions of a sick woman suffering from severe postpartum psychosis. The lawyer pointed out that Marcus had a stable, luxurious home, a massive executive income, and the full loving support of his extended family to help raise the infant. I had a motel receipt and a military coat. The judge didn't even deliberate for long. He adjusted his glasses, shuffled his papers, and looked down at me with a profound, sickening pity. Given the mother's current lack of stable housing and employment, and taking into account the sworn testimony regarding her mental state, this court must prioritize the safety and immediate physical well-being of the infant, the judge announced. The heavy wooden gavel hit the sounding block with a sharp, terrifying crack. It sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. Temporary primary physical and legal custody is awarded to the father, Marcus Vance. The mother is granted strictly supervised visitation bi-weekly at the County Family Center. This order is effective immediately. All the air rushed out of my lungs. The room began to spin, the edges of my vision going dark. The floor felt like it was dropping out from underneath me. They had done it. They had lied, cheated, and legally stolen my daughter. A female bailiff approached my table. Her face was sympathetic, but her voice was firm. She told me I had to surrender the child to the father before leaving the courthouse premises. I walked out into the echoing marble hallway, my legs feeling like lead weights. Marcus and Chloe were already waiting by the elevators. Brenda was standing behind them, a triumphant, malicious gleam in her eyes as she watched my devastation. I looked down at Zara. She was awake, her tiny dark eyes blinking up at the bright, harsh fluorescent lights. My heart physically ached, a sharp tearing sensation ripping through the center of my chest. I pressed a desperate kiss to her soft forehead, breathing in the sweet, milky scent of her skin. "I love you," I whispered into her warm blanket, my voice finally cracking. "I will come back for you. I promise you Mama will come back." I stepped forward and reluctantly extended my aching arms. Marcus didn't take her. He stepped back, crossed his arms over his chest, and nodded to Chloe. Chloe stepped forward, her designer heels clicking sharply on the marble. She reached out and took my daughter from my arms. She didn't hold Zara naturally. She held her awkwardly, stiffly, like an expensive, fragile accessory she didn't quite know how to carry. The sudden emptiness in my arms was suffocating. Chloe looked me dead in the eye over Zara's head. A slow, victorious smirk spread across her perfectly painted lips. She had everything she wanted. She had my husband, she had my home, and now she had my child. As Chloe shifted her weight to adjust the baby in her arms, her heavy leather designer purse slipped off her shoulder. It hit the marble floor with a loud thud, spilling a few items across the polished stone. A tube of red lipstick, a gold compact mirror, and a folded piece of heavy cream-colored paper. "Let me get that," Marcus said quickly, bending down to retrieve her scattered makeup. But the folded piece of paper had slid across the smooth floor, stopping right at the toe of my worn black shoe. I bent down and picked it up. As my freezing fingers brushed the paper, it naturally fell open. I fully intended to hand it right back to her without a word. But my eyes automatically scanned the bold black text printed at the very top of the page. It was an official financial receipt from a private, highly exclusive international adoption agency. I froze. The receipt bore Chloe's full name, confirming a massive final payment for a newborn adoption. But that wasn't what made the blood run entirely cold in my veins. I stared at the finalized date of the adoption printed clearly at the bottom of the receipt. The date was over 8 months ago. But the baby Chloe had brought into my living room, the child she proudly claimed was her brand new biological son, with Marcus couldn't be more than 3 weeks old. The frost on the inside of my windshield was thick enough to scrape off with my fingernail. I pulled the thin, scratchy sleeping bag tighter around my shoulders, my breath pluming in the freezing air of the big box store parking lot. My bones ached with a deep, settling cold that no amount of layering could fix. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the hollow, tearing sensation in my chest. My arms felt physically empty. It was a biological ache, a primal need to hold my daughter that left me gasping for air in the quiet darkness of my car. I checked the digital clock on the dashboard. 6 in the morning. I had 4 hours until my supervised visitation. I forced my stiff, shivering body out of the back seat and climbed into the driver's side. The engine turned over with a painful sputter, the heater blowing nothing but frigid air as I drove across the empty, icy lot toward the 24-hour grocery store. I spent 20 minutes in the harsh fluorescent light of the public restroom, washing my face and arms in the freezing sink. I carefully applied the little makeup I had left, trying desperately to mask the dark, bruised circles under my exhausted eyes. I brushed out my hair, pinning it back tightly to look professional. I ironed my wrinkled skirt with the palms of my hands. I absolutely refused to walk into that county facility looking like the broken, unstable woman they claimed I was. The family center smelled of harsh bleach and old paper. The waiting room was painted a depressing institutional beige, illuminated by humming overhead lights that gave everything a sickly yellow cast. I sat on a hard plastic chair, my hands folded tightly in my lap, staring at the heavy wooden door leading to the visitation rooms. Every time the handle clicked, my heart slammed against my ribs. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second stretching into an eternity. Finally, a social worker with a tired expression and a heavy clipboard called my name. She led me down a narrow hallway and into a small, windowless room containing a single plastic table and 3 chairs. She took a seat in the corner without a word, her pen poised over her paperwork. I stood by the table, wiping my sweating palms on my skirt. Then the door opened. Marcus walked in first, wearing a casual cashmere sweater and a relaxed smile. He looked like a man arriving at a pleasant Sunday brunch. Right behind him was Chloe. She was draped in a designer wool coat, her hair perfectly styled, and in Chloe's arms was Zara. A physical jolt rocked through my entire body. I took a step forward, my arms reaching out instinctively, a desperate, breathless sound escaping my throat. Chloe didn't hand her to me immediately. She took her time adjusting the expensive pale pink boutique blanket wrapped tightly around my baby. She looked at me with an expression of performative pity perfectly calibrated for the social worker sitting quietly in the corner. "She's been a little fussy this morning," Chloe said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "We think she might be slightly colicky. We've got her on a strict feeding schedule now to help her digestion." I bit the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted copper. I reached out again and Chloe finally transferred my daughter into my waiting arms. The moment Zara's weight settled against my chest, a hot tear slipped down my cheek. She smelled different. The comforting scent of my lavender baby lotion was gone, replaced by the faint powdery smell of Chloe's expensive perfume. But her tiny warm weight was exactly the same. She was perfect. "You want to make sure you're supporting her neck, Maya," Chloe instructed softly, stepping closer to my personal space. "She likes it when you hold her a little higher up on your chest. Like this." Chloe actually reached out and physically adjusted my arm. It took every ounce of military discipline I possessed not to shove her hand away. I kept my eyes focused entirely on Zara, gently stroking her soft cheek with my thumb, breathing in the sight of her. "She's doing incredibly well in the new nursery," Marcus said, pulling out one of the plastic chairs and sitting down across from me. "Sleeping almost through the night. It's amazing what a stable, calm environment can do for an infant's development." The social worker was writing notes on her clipboard, completely oblivious to the psychological warfare happening right in front of her. I sat down carefully, holding Zara close, rocking her gently in my lap. I refused to engage with their bait. I just hummed softly to my daughter, memorizing the curve of her eyelashes, the tiny shape of her fingers. I tuned out the sterile room and focused entirely on the steady beat of her small heart against mine. "You know, Maya, this doesn't have to be so difficult," Marcus whispered, leaning across the table so the social worker couldn't hear. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, familiar stack of papers. He slid them smoothly across the scratched plastic surface until they touched my elbow. The divorce papers. "You're living in your car," he continued, his voice dropping to a low, intimate murmur that made my skin crawl. "You have no money, no prospects. You are dragging this out for absolutely no reason." I didn't look up from Zara's face. "I'm not signing them, Marcus. If you sign them," he pressed his tone, turning falsely generous, "I'll talk to my lawyers. We can bypass all this supervised nonsense. I might even let you have her for Christmas this year. A clean break, Maya. Just walk away for her sake." "Don't you dare pretend you care about her sake," I whispered back, my voice shaking with a rage so potent it frightened me. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his relaxed smile returning. He glanced over at Chloe, who offered him a knowing, satisfied nod. The rest of the hour was sheer agonizing torture. They hovered over me, they corrected how I rocked her, they played the perfect wealthy parents stepping in to save a child from a destitute, unstable mother. When the social worker finally announced that our time was up, I felt my heart physically shatter all over again. Handing Zara back to Chloe was like willingly stepping into a fire. My arms instantly felt cold, my chest caved in. I watched them walk out the door, Zara's tiny head resting securely over Chloe's expensive coat, and I thought I might actually die from the pain of it. I don't remember walking out of the building. I just suddenly found myself standing in the freezing parking lot, the bitter wind whipping my hair across my face. I stumbled toward my battered car, my vision completely blurred by thick, blinding tears. I unlocked the door, fell into the driver's seat, and slammed it shut. The silence of the car was suffocating. I gripped the steering wheel, leaned my forehead against the cold plastic, and let out a broken, wretched sob. The adrenaline was gone, leaving nothing but sheer, absolute despair. I was failing. I was freezing, exhausted, and completely outgunned. Marcus had unlimited resources, a luxurious home, and a team of expensive sharks. I had a half-empty tank of gas and a pile of stolen code on a laptop I could barely keep charged. I looked over at the passenger seat. The thick stack of divorce papers sat there mocking me. Marcus must have slipped them into my canvas bag when I wasn't looking. I stared at the signature line on the crisp white paper. The temptation to just give up washed over me like a heavy dark wave. If I signed them, the legal attacks would stop. Marcus would finally back off. Zara would have a warm bed, a beautiful nursery, and a life of absolute financial security. I wouldn't have to fight anymore. I wouldn't have to freeze in parking lots. I could just disappear into the background, broken, but certain that my daughter was safe from poverty. Was my pride worth her suffering? I reached into the center console with trembling fingers. I pulled out a cheap plastic pen. My hand was shaking so violently I could barely uncap it. I picked up the heavy stack of legal documents and rested them against the steering wheel. I placed the tip of the pen against the signature line. A fresh hot tear dropped onto the paper, blurring the black ink. I closed my eyes, preparing to surrender my entire life. Suddenly, the loud crunch of heavy tires rolling over frozen gravel shattered the quiet of the parking lot. I opened my eyes. A sleek, midnight black town car, with heavily tinted windows, pulled into the empty space directly beside my battered sedan. It stopped, the powerful engine idling with a low, expensive purr. The back passenger window rolled down smoothly. I wiped my face quickly, my heart jumping into my throat as a sharp, impeccably dressed African-American woman leaned forward, her piercing gaze locked directly onto mine through the open window. "Put the pen down, Maya," she said, her voice carrying a quiet, absolute authority. "My name is Victoria Sterling, and I believe you have something that belongs to me." I stared at the woman through the freezing half-open window of my car. Victoria Sterling. The name echoed in my exhausted mind. I recognized her instantly from the corporate dossiers I had decrypted on my battered laptop just 2 nights ago. She was the founder and CEO of Sterling Corporation, Chloe's biggest rival in the defense tech industry. Victoria wasn't wearing a heavy winter coat, just a sharply tailored wool blazer. She didn't seem to feel the biting winter wind at all. She just looked at me with dark, intelligent eyes that missed absolutely nothing. "Get in the car, Maya," she said, her voice smooth, but carrying the unmistakable weight of a command. "Your daughter is freezing and you look like you haven't slept in a week. We have a lot to discuss." Every combat survival instinct I had honed in the military screamed at me to roll up the window and drive away. Trusting a powerful stranger after my own husband had just orchestrated my complete ruin felt like stepping onto a minefield blindfolded. But I looked down at Zara, shivering slightly in her car seat. I looked at the divorce papers sitting on my dashboard. I was entirely out of options. I shoved the cheap plastic pen back into the center console. I unbuckled Zara, wrapped her tightly in my heavy coat, and stepped out into the bitter wind. The inside of Victoria's town car was a different world. It was blissfully, intoxicatingly warm, smelling faintly of rich leather and expensive espresso. I sank into the plush seat, pulling Zara close to my chest as the heavy door clicked shut, sealing out the howling parking lot wind. Victoria sat across from me, pouring a cup of hot coffee from a silver thermos built into the console. She handed it to me without a single word. The heat of the ceramic cup against my frozen fingers brought actual tears to my eyes. "Drink," Victoria said gently, though her gaze remained piercing. "You're running on fumes and pure adrenaline." I took a slow, shaky sip. "How did you find me?" "I have an exceptionally good security team," Victoria replied, crossing her legs. "We've been tracking Marcus and Chloe for 6 months. I know they stole my proprietary defense software. I know they've been merging their assets to prepare for a massive corporate launch. What I didn't know was how they were hiding the stolen source code. She leaned forward, her dark eyes locking onto mine, until my team picked up a highly advanced, unauthorized decryption script pinging off the local network from a cheap motel 2 nights ago, a script written with military-grade architecture, the exact kind of architecture used by an honorably discharged combat security engineer. My heart hammered against my ribs. She knew exactly who I was. She knew exactly what I had. "You have the flash drive, Maya," Victoria stated. It wasn't a question. "Marcus failed to secure it, and you took it. You are currently holding the smoking gun that can destroy their entire empire." I wrapped my hands tighter around the coffee cup, forcing my breathing to remain steady. "If I have it, why should I give it to you? My husband just drained my bank accounts and took my child. I need leverage right now. I need survival." A slow, genuine smile spread across Victoria's face. It was the smile of a woman who respected a fighter. "I'm not asking for charity," she said. "I am offering an alliance. You have the raw data, but you don't have the resources to weaponize it. You are living in a frozen sedan. Marcus has expensive lawyers, and Chloe has millions in offshore accounts." She reached into a sleek leather briefcase beside her and pulled out a heavy embossed folder, placing it gently on the seat between us. "I want my software back, and I want to see them burn for stealing it," Victoria said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. "In exchange, I am offering you the position of Chief Security Analyst at Sterling Corporation. The salary is in the mid-six figures." I stared at the folder, my mind struggling to process the sudden violent shift in my reality. "That folder contains the keys to a corporate luxury apartment in downtown," Victoria continued. "It is heavily guarded, fully furnished, and currently stocked with everything a newborn baby could possibly need. You will have a company car, a secure phone, and a fully funded expense account." I looked down at Zara, who was finally sleeping peacefully in the absolute warmth of the town car. The thought of placing her in a real crib in a warm, safe room was a temptation so powerful it physically ached. "And the custody battle?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Marcus has emergency custody. He has the judge in his pocket." Victoria's expression softened just a fraction, but her eyes remained fierce. "I am also giving you unlimited access to Evelyn Vance," Victoria said. "She is my personal family law attorney. She is an absolute bulldog, and she has never lost a case. We will drown Marcus in so much litigation he won't be able to breathe. We will get your daughter back." It felt too good to be true. It felt like a trap. But as I looked at Victoria Sterling, I didn't see the smug, condescending cruelty of Chloe or Brenda. I saw a brilliant, ruthless businesswoman who needed my expertise just as badly as I needed her resources. Our goals were perfectly, completely aligned. I reached into the deep pocket of my military parka. My fingers brushed against the cold, hard plastic of the flash drive. I pulled it out and placed it directly onto the embossed folder. "I'm in," I said. Victoria nodded, picking up the drive. "Welcome to Sterling Corporation, Maya. Let's get you home." The drive to the city center was a blur. We pulled into the secure underground parking garage of a stunning glass-walled high-rise. A uniformed concierge greeted Victoria by name and handed me a heavy brass key card. My new apartment was on the 32nd floor. When I unlocked the heavy oak door and stepped inside, I completely lost my breath. It was magnificent. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping, unobstructed view of the city skyline. The furniture was modern and plush. The heating was completely silent and perfectly calibrated. But the most beautiful sight was in the second bedroom. Just as Victoria had promised, a beautiful, sturdy mahogany crib sat in the corner, stocked with soft, warm blankets. I laid Zara gently onto the mattress. She stretched her tiny arms, letting out a soft, contented sigh. For the first time in a week, I didn't have to worry about her freezing to death in a dark parking lot. I walked into the master bathroom. It was clad in white marble, featuring a massive glass-enclosed shower. I stripped off my damp, heavy clothes and stepped under the water. The scorching heat hit my aching shoulders and bruised back. I stood there for nearly an hour, letting the thick steam clear the absolute terror from my lungs. The freezing snow, the dingy motel, the humiliation at the courthouse, it all washed down the drain. When I finally stepped out and wrapped myself in a thick, luxurious towel, the exhausted, broken victim was gone. The woman looking back at me in the fogged mirror was a strategist. She was a soldier who had just been handed an entire armory. I walked out into the spacious living area. Sitting on the sleek glass dining table was a brand new, top-of-the-line corporate laptop. It was heavy encrypted and ready for war. Victoria had left it for me to begin analyzing the vulnerabilities in the code Marcus had stolen. I sat down at the table, a strange, calm energy settling over me. I opened the laptop and pressed the power button. The screen glowed to life, connecting instantly to the secure corporate network. Before I could even open the decryption software, a loud, sharp chime echoed from the speakers. A breaking news alert flashed aggressively across the center of the screen. My eyes scanned the bold red headline and my blood ran entirely cold. Marcus and Chloe had just called a live press conference. They were officially announcing a massive multi-million-dollar government contract bid using Victoria's stolen defense software as their flagship product. The smiling faces of my husband and his mistress beamed from my laptop screen. The breaking news banner flashed across the bottom, boasting about their multi-million-dollar government bid. They were parading Victoria's stolen defense software as their own brilliant creation. A few days ago, seeing that broadcast would have broken me. It would have sent me spiraling into panic. But as I sat in the silent luxury of my new high-rise apartment, I didn't cry. I just felt the cold, familiar grip of my military discipline taking the wheel. I closed the newsfeed and opened the decryption software Victoria had provided. They wanted to play a high-stakes game of corporate warfare. They had no idea they just invited a combat engineer to the table. Over the next few weeks, my life settled into a quiet, relentless rhythm. During the day, I sat in a secure, windowless war room deep inside Sterling Corporation. My fingers flew across the keyboard, analyzing every single line of the code Marcus and Chloe had stolen. It didn't take me long to find it. Marcus had always been arrogant. He always believed he was the smartest man in the room, constantly cutting corners to get to the finish line faster. In his rush to rebrand Victoria's software for the government bid, he had failed to patch a massive foundational vulnerability in the core architecture. It was a fatal flaw. If triggered, it would collapse their entire system in seconds. I documented the vulnerability, encrypting my findings onto a secure server. I had the exact weapon I needed to destroy their professional empire, but destroying their company wasn't enough. I needed to destroy their lies. I needed my daughter back. That's where Evelyn came in. Victoria's personal family law attorney was a terrifyingly efficient woman. She didn't offer warm smiles or sympathetic pats on the back. She offered results. She walked into my office late one Thursday afternoon, dropping a heavy leather-bound folder onto my desk. "We found the money, Maya," Evelyn said, her voice sharp and clinical. "Every single penny." She opened the folder and spread a series of bank statements across the glass table. I stared at the paper trail of my stolen life. Evelyn's forensic accountants had tracked the $90,000 Marcus had drained from our joint savings. He hadn't just moved it, he had funneled it through 3 different shell companies before hiding it in a private offshore account in the Cayman Islands. "It shows premeditation," Evelyn explained, tapping a manicured fingernail against the transfer dates. "He orchestrated total financial ruin while you were actively in labor. No judge in the state will view this as anything other than severe financial abuse." "And my mother-in-law?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper as I traced the numbers on the page. "We are finalizing the proof of her perjury right now," Evelyn replied, a predatory gleam in her eye. "We are pulling security footage from your old neighborhood and interviewing neighbors. By the time we go back to court, Brenda's sworn testimony will be completely shredded." The trap was set. All I had to do was wait for the jaws to snap shut. But waiting was absolute agony. The hardest part of my new life wasn't the exhausting hours of coding or the complex legal strategy. It was the bi-weekly supervised visits at the county family center. Every other Tuesday, I had to walk into that sterile fluorescent-lit room and pretend my heart wasn't bleeding out. The military taught me how to survive torture, and that's exactly what those visits were. Pure psychological torture. Before my next visit, I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in my luxury apartment. Victoria had generously funded a new wardrobe for me, insisting that corporate executives did not wear worn-out parkas. I slipped on a tailored charcoal designer trench coat and a pair of sleek black leather boots. I pinned my natural hair back into a flawless, elegant twist. I looked healthy. I looked wealthy. I looked absolutely untouchable. When I walked into the visitation room, Marcus and Chloe were already there. They were sitting side by side, whispering and laughing, waiting for the broken homeless woman they had created to shuffle through the door. Instead, I walked in with my head held high, my heels clicking sharply against the cheap linoleum floor. Marcus's laughter died instantly in his throat. His eyes widened, raking over my designer coat and perfectly styled hair. He looked deeply confused, his mind struggling to reconcile the desperate woman he had left freezing in the snow with the polished executive standing in front of him. Chloe's eyes narrowed into angry slits. She shifted Zara aggressively in her arms, her knuckles turning white. "You're late," Chloe snapped through the clock on the wall clearly showed I was 5 minutes early. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply held out my arms. "I'll take my daughter now, Chloe." I said, my voice smooth, calm, and utterly devoid of emotion. She reluctantly handed Zara over. The moment my baby's warm weight settled against my chest, a fierce, desperate ache threatened to crack my composure. Zara cooed, wrapping her tiny, soft fingers around the lapel of my coat. I wanted to bury my face in her neck and sob. I wanted to scream at Marcus for what he was doing to us. Instead, I forced my breathing to slow. I built a brick wall around my emotions, sealing the pain deep inside. I sat down in the plastic chair and rocked Zara gently, ignoring the two monsters sitting across the table. Marcus leaned forward, unable to handle my silence. He thrived on my misery. He needed my tears to validate his ego. "Did you find a slightly better motel, Maya?" Marcus sneered, trying to get a rise out of me. "Or did you just blow your last $50 on a coat to impress the social worker?" I didn't look up from Zara's beautiful face. I just kept rocking her, humming a soft, rhythmic lullaby. "You can't keep this up," he whispered, leaning closer, his voice laced with venom. "You have nothing. You are nothing. Sign the papers, Maya. Stop embarrassing yourself." My raw, emotional urge to reach across the table and physically lash out was suffocating. My hands trembled slightly against Zara's blanket, but I remembered the offshore bank statement sitting on Evelyn's desk. I remembered the vulnerability in his stolen code. I was holding all the cards. I just had to keep playing the game. I finally looked up, meeting his angry, frustrated gaze with eyes as cold as winter ice. "I hope you're sleeping well, Marcus," I said softly, a faint, knowing smile playing on my lips. "Enjoy your new house." His jaw clenched. My complete detachment was driving him crazy. He expected me to beg. He expected me to shatter. Facing a brick wall severely unnerved him, and Chloe looked equally unsettled by my total lack of despair. When the hour was up, I handed Zara back without shedding a single tear. I offered a polite nod to the social worker and walked out of the room, my posture rigidly straight. I stepped out of the county facility and into the crisp afternoon air. I pulled my designer coat tighter around myself and walked briskly toward my company-issued car. I was so focused on keeping my emotions in check, so focused on not breaking down in the parking lot, that I didn't notice the silver sedan idling near the exit. I didn't see my mother-in-law, Brenda, sitting behind the steering wheel. Brenda had always been deeply suspicious. When Marcus told her about my strange, polished appearance at the previous visit, she hadn't believed him. She had come to the county center today to see for herself. She wanted to see the broken daughter-in-law she had evicted. Instead, she watched me unlock a sleek, late-model luxury sedan. I slid into the driver's seat and pulled out of the lot, heading straight back to the office to finish my code analysis. I navigated the city traffic completely unaware that Brenda was tailing me, staying 2 car lengths behind. I pulled up to the heavily guarded wrought iron gates of Victoria Sterling's massive corporate headquarters. The uniformed security guard smiled, recognizing my vehicle. He waved me through, instantly the heavy gates swinging open to grant me exclusive access to the private underground executive garage. Parked across the street, partially hidden behind a delivery truck, Brenda watched the entire exchange. Her eyes widened in absolute shock as she stared at the gleaming monolithic Sterling Corporation logo etched into the side of the glass building. Her hands shook as she reached for her cell phone. She raised it to the steering wheel, zooming in through her windshield. The camera shutter clicked repeatedly, capturing clear, high-definition photos of my car, slipping seamlessly into the fortress of her son's greatest corporate rival. My phone vibrated against the glass desk with a sharp, angry buzz. I ignored it, keeping my eyes fixed on the lines of code scrolling across my dual monitors in the secure war room of Sterling Corporation. But then it buzzed again, and again. 3 rapid pulsing alerts. I picked up the device and tapped the screen. A live notification popped up from the state-of-the-art security system Victoria had installed in my new apartment. The alert glowed red in the center of the screen. Motion detected. Front door breached. My breath caught in my throat. I tapped the camera icon, bringing up the live high-definition feed of my living room. The heavy oak door was wide open. Standing in the center of my plush rug, breathing heavily, was Marcus. He looked completely unhinged. His expensive tailored suit jacket was discarded on the floor. His tie was pulled loose, hanging haphazardly around his neck. He was pacing like a trapped animal, his eyes darting frantically around the immaculate space. He was sweating, completely devoid of the smug arrogance he usually wore like armor. "Maya!" Evelyn's sharp voice cut through the silence of the office. The lawyer had just walked in, holding a thick stack of manila folders. "What are you looking at?" "My husband," I said quietly, sliding the phone across the glass desk so she could see. Evelyn leaned in, her eyes narrowing as she watched the live feed. "He broke into your apartment. Does he know where you work?" "Brenda must have followed me after the supervised visit yesterday." I realized the puzzle pieces clicking into place. She probably snapped photos of my car pulling into the Sterling executive garage. She ran back and told them I was here. Now they know I'm working with Victoria. Panic is a terrifying thing to watch in someone who always believed he was untouchable. On the small screen, Marcus grabbed the cushions off my sofa and threw them to the floor. He yanked open the drawers of my media console, dumping the contents onto the rug. He was desperate. He was searching for the one thing that could send him to federal prison. "He's looking for the flash drive," I murmured, watching him tear apart my safe space. "Let him look," Evelyn said, a cold, predatory smile touching her lips. "This security footage is saving directly to our secure cloud. He just handed us a felony breaking and entering charge on a silver platter. The family court judge is going to absolutely devour him." I watched Marcus stumble into the nursery. My heart slammed against my ribs. He stood over Zara's crib, his chest heaving as he ripped the soft blankets away, violently searching underneath the mattress. The sheer violation of it made my hands curl into tight fists. He had kicked his own newborn daughter out into the freezing snow, and now he was tearing apart her bed just to save his own skin. He found nothing, of course. The drive was locked in a biometric safe inside Victoria's personal vault. Marcus backed out of the nursery, running his hands over his face in absolute despair. He pulled out his cell phone, his hands shaking as he dialed a number. Even without audio, I could see him yelling into the receiver. He looked broken. He looked like a man who finally realized the ground beneath him was crumbling into dust. I tapped the screen, securing the recording, and pushed the phone away. I refused to let his panic dictate my emotions. I had to stay focused on the long game. "We have the break-in secured," I said, looking up at Evelyn and forcing my heart rate to slow. "What do you have in those folders?" Evelyn's demeanor shifted instantly from amused to fiercely professional. She dropped the heavy files onto my desk with a loud, satisfying thud. "We started digging into Chloe's background to prepare for the custody hearing," Evelyn explained, pulling up a leather chair and sitting across from me. "You asked me to look into that adoption agency receipt you found at the courthouse, the one with the date that didn't match the age of their new baby." "Did you find the agency?" I asked, leaning forward. "I found a lot more than that," Evelyn said, opening the top folder. "It took my best private investigators 2 weeks to untangle the financial web. Chloe didn't just use a shady adoption agency. She used an international black market ring that specializes in forging documents for wealthy, desperate clients." She slid a piece of heavy parchment paper toward me. It was a copy of a medical record heavily redacted but clear enough to read the terrifying truth printed at the bottom. "Chloe is sterile, Maya," Evelyn stated quietly. "She has been for over a decade. She is completely incapable of having biological children." The sterile, windowless office suddenly felt entirely devoid of air. I stared at the medical record, my mind struggling to process the sheer magnitude of the lie. "But she brought a newborn into my house," I whispered, remembering the sickening smell of her floral perfume as she held the infant in my living room. "She claimed she and Marcus had a baby together. Brenda practically celebrated it. She told me I was a dead weight and paraded that child around as Marcus's true heir." Evelyn slid another document across the desk. This one was a financial ledger showing a massive offshore wire transfer. "Chloe purchased that child, Maya," Evelyn said, her voice dropping to a low, intense register. "She bought a newborn using illegal, untraceable channels and forged the birth certificates to make it look like a domestic birth. The date on the receipt you found was the day she paid the initial black market deposit months before the baby was actually born." I leaned back in my chair, the blood roaring in my ears. The cruelty of it was absolutely breathtaking. Chloe had paraded a purchased child into my home while I was bleeding and exhausted from giving birth to my own flesh and blood. She had used an innocent baby as a prop to establish dominance and humiliate me. "Why would she go to such extreme illegal lengths?" I asked, looking up at Evelyn, my voice shaking with a potent mix of horror and rage. "She has millions of dollars. She could have adopted legally. She could have used a surrogate." "Because legal channels take years and they require thorough, invasive background checks," Evelyn explained, tapping a manicured finger on the desk. "And more importantly, a legal adoption requires both partners to be heavily involved in the process. Chloe didn't want a long, drawn-out process. She needed an immediate, unbreakable anchor." Evelyn reached into the file and pulled out the final document. It was a copy of Marcus and Chloe's recent marriage certificate, along with a massive corporate asset merger agreement. "Look at the dates," Evelyn instructed. I scanned the thick legal paperwork. The asset merger, effectively tying Marcus's financial future entirely to Chloe's company, was signed just 3 days after the black market adoption was finalized. The marriage certificate was signed a week later. She needed to trap him. I realized the cold truth washing over me like ice water. "Marcus is arrogant, but he's also flighty. He was legally married to me. He had a baby on the way. Chloe needed a permanent way to lock him down, to merge their assets, and to ensure his absolute loyalty before they launched the stolen software." "Exactly." Evelyn nodded, her eyes dark and serious. A brand new, supposedly biological son was the perfect bait. It stroked his massive ego and forced his hand. She presented him with a ready-made family and a corporate empire. He threw you away because he thought he was trading up to a legacy. I stared at the forged birth certificate lying on my desk. The name Marcus Vance was typed neatly on the line for the father. My mind flashed back to the day of the emergency custody hearing. I remembered Marcus sitting in the courtroom looking so smug and secure, surrounded by his expensive lawyers. I remembered him holding the baby in the county visitation center, boasting loudly about the stable, wealthy environment they were providing. He had strutted around with the absolute confidence of a man who believed he had won everything. I looked closely at the signature lines on the black market adoption papers. Chloe's signature was there, sharp and elegant. There were signatures from fake doctors and a corrupt notary public, but Marcus's signature was nowhere on the adoption paperwork. I pulled the documents closer, my eyes darting between the dates of the offshore wire transfers and the timeline of Marcus's affair. The puzzle pieces locked together with a deafening crack. Cross-referencing the forged adoption papers, I realized with absolute certainty that Marcus has no idea the baby isn't his biological son. I stared at the forged adoption papers resting on the glass desk, the sheer magnitude of the deception echoing in the quiet war room. Marcus had thrown away our entire life, our marriage, and his own biological daughter for a child that wasn't even his. He was nothing but a pawn in Chloe's corporate chess game, completely blind to the fact that his new wealthy legacy was bought on the black market. "He has absolutely no idea," I whispered, the realization sending a cold, sharp thrill through my veins. Evelyn leaned back in her leather chair, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across her face. "Chloe played him perfectly. She forged a family to merge their assets, locked him into a marriage, and tied his name to a stolen tech empire. When the ship goes down, he goes down right alongside her." I looked across the room at Victoria. She was standing by the monitors watching me with dark, calculating eyes. The time for gathering evidence in the shadows was over. We had the weapon. It was time to pull the trigger. "Let's burn it down," I said. Victoria didn't hesitate. She walked over and opened a secure, untraceable terminal on her heavy corporate laptop. We had spent the last 2 days carefully extracting a tiny, highly encrypted fragment of the stolen plagiarism evidence. It was just enough to prove the defense software was dangerously compromised, exposing the fatal flaw Marcus had failed to patch, but not enough to give away our full hand. I sat at the keyboard and typed in the direct classified email address for the Department of Defense Oversight Committee. My fingers didn't tremble. I didn't feel an ounce of hesitation. I hit send. The transmission bar flashed bright green. The data was gone. Within 24 hours, the Pentagon will realize their multi-million-dollar defense contract is tied to stolen, highly vulnerable code, Victoria said quietly, closing the laptop with a soft click. The federal audit won't just be a polite inquiry. It will be an absolute execution. The waiting was agonizing, but the fierce military discipline ingrained in my bones held my nerves perfectly in check. 2 mornings later, the day of my final family court hearing had finally arrived. I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of my high-rise apartment, buttoning a tailored charcoal gray blazer. I looked polished, professional, and completely untouchable. My secure phone buzzed sharply on the nightstand. It was a text message from Victoria. "Federal agents just walked into Chloe's corporate headquarters. No warning. Every server is currently being seized." I read the words twice, feeling the first real wave of profound satisfaction I had allowed myself in months. A second message immediately followed. "The Department of Justice just issued an emergency freeze on all assets tied to their merged LLC. Marcus is officially locked out. Every offshore account, every joint credit line. He has absolutely nothing." I looked at my reflection in the cold glass. The broken, freezing woman shivering at a suburban bus stop was a distant memory. Today, I was taking my daughter back. I walked down to the waiting town car where Evelyn was already sitting in the back seat reviewing a thick stack of pristine legal folders. She looked up, her expression terrifyingly calm and ready for war. "Are you ready to end this?" Evelyn asked. "More than ready," I replied. The atmosphere inside the county family courthouse was suffocatingly tense. I sat quietly at the petitioner's table, my back perfectly straight, my hands folded neatly in my lap. When the heavy oak doors swung open, Marcus walked in. The smug, arrogant executive who had laughed at my pain months ago was entirely gone. He looked completely unraveled. His expensive tie was crooked. He was sweating profusely, his eyes darting frantically around the room, and he clutched his cell phone with white-knuckled desperation. Chloe walked slightly ahead of him, her usual icy polished demeanor cracking violently under the strain. She looked exhausted, her jaw tight with barely suppressed panic. They had clearly just received the terrifying news about the federal raid. Their expensive legal team looked equally unsettled, whispering urgently to one another as they quickly took their seats. The judge, the same stern-faced man who had previously stripped me of my daughter, took the bench. He adjusted his reading glasses and looked down at us. "We are here to review the temporary custody order," the judge announced, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "Counsel, you may proceed." Marcus's lead attorney stood up, straightening his suit jacket. But before he could even open his mouth, Evelyn was on her feet. She didn't offer polite legal pleasantries. She launched a targeted, devastating strike. "Your Honor, we are filing an emergency motion for immediate primary custody, accompanied by a request for a permanent restraining order against Mr. Vance." Evelyn stated, her voice carrying absolute, unshakable authority. The opposing lawyer sputtered, slamming his hand on the wooden table. "Objection, Your Honor. This is highly irregular and completely unacceptable. The mother's unstable mental state and severe financial ruin have already been established by this court. The only thing established in this courtroom was rampant malicious perjury," Evelyn fired back, stepping boldly into the center aisle. She handed a heavy digital storage drive directly to the bailiff. "Your Honor, we are submitting Exhibit A, high-definition security footage recorded inside my client's secure residence just 4 days ago." Evelyn connected a tablet to the courtroom monitors. The large screen flickered to life. There was Marcus. In brilliant, undeniable clarity, the entire courtroom watched him violently kick open my front door. They watched him tear apart my immaculate living room. They watched him rip the soft blankets off his own infant daughter's crib in a frantic, completely unhinged search for the missing flash drive. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. The judge stared intensely at the screen, his face flushing with visible righteous anger. Marcus sank lower into his leather chair, the blood draining completely from his face. He looked physically ill. Evelyn didn't give them a single second to recover. Exhibit B. Evelyn continued, handing a thick stack of certified documents to the bailiff. Financial records proving that Mr. Vance systematically drained $90,000 from a joint savings account on the exact day his wife was in the hospital labor ward. The judge flipped rapidly through the pages, his expression hardening into cold stone. "Furthermore, Your Honor," Evelyn said, her voice echoing powerfully off the wood-paneled walls, "we have provided irrefutable paper trails connecting those stolen funds to offshore shell companies, and we have included banking records showing a direct, undocumented cash transfer of $20,000 to Brenda Vance just 48 hours before she took the stand in this very room and committed blatant perjury to destroy my client's character." Marcus's expensive lawyers were completely paralyzed. There was no clever argument to make. There was no legal spin to apply. The evidence was absolute, and it was entirely bulletproof. "Mr. Vance," the judge said, his voice dangerously quiet, "did you physically break into the petitioner's home? Did you falsify medical claims to freeze her bank accounts while stealing joint assets?" Marcus opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked desperately at his lawyers, but they were already leaning away from him, frantically trying to distance themselves from a client now facing federal fraud and severe perjury charges. "Your Honor, my client is currently dealing with a massive, unprecedented corporate crisis," his lawyer stammered weakly, unable to meet the judge's eyes. "I don't care about his corporate crisis," the judge roared, the sudden violent volume making Chloe flinch in her seat. "I care about the fact that this court was weaponized. I care about a mother who was wrongfully separated from her infant child through calculated malicious fraud." The judge didn't hesitate. He grabbed his heavy wooden gavel. "The temporary custody order is vacated immediately," the judge declared, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "Full legal and physical custody is awarded solely to the mother, Maya Vance. All visitation rights for the father are suspended indefinitely." The gavel slammed down against the sounding block. It was the most beautiful, liberating sound I had ever heard. "Furthermore," the judge continued, glaring directly at a trembling Marcus, "a permanent restraining order is granted. You are to stay 500 yards away from Maya and Zara Vance at all times. Bailiff, ensure the child is transferred to the mother immediately." I walked out into the echoing marble hallway. My legs felt incredibly light. The suffocating heavy weight that had crushed my chest for months was finally completely gone. A county social worker emerged from the waiting room holding Zara. I didn't wait for her to walk over. I closed the distance and reached out with aching arms. The moment my daughter's warm, familiar weight settled against my chest, a profound sense of absolute peace washed over my soul. I buried my face in her soft hair, breathing in her sweet scent. I didn't have to hand her back to a smirking mistress in an hour. I didn't have to endure supervised torture. Zara was mine. We were finally safe. I wrapped her securely in her soft blanket and walked toward the heavy glass doors of the courthouse exit. Evelyn walked beside me, a rare, genuine smile touching her sharp features. "You won, Maya," Evelyn said quietly. "We won," I corrected, stepping out into the bright, crisp afternoon sunlight. The fresh winter air felt amazing. I carried my daughter down the wide concrete steps, heading toward the secure parking garage where our company vehicle was waiting. I was ready to go home. I was ready to start our real, thriving life. As I walked deeper into the shadowed concrete levels of the parking structure, the sharp echo of rapid, heavy footsteps broke the quiet atmosphere. "Maya, stop right there." I turned around. It was Marcus. He looked completely deranged. He had abandoned Chloe and his scrambling lawyers inside the building. His face was flushed a dangerous mottled red, his chest heaving as he marched aggressively across the asphalt toward me. The restraining order hadn't even been officially processed by the clerk yet, and his arrogant hubris was already overriding his basic common sense. "What did you do?" Marcus screamed, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated panic. "My bank accounts are frozen. The feds are tearing my office apart. Victoria Sterling is locking me out of my own life." He lunged forward, closing the distance rapidly, his hands balled into tight, shaking fists. "You think you can just take my money? You think you can destroy my company?" I didn't flinch. I didn't step back. I just held Zara closer to my chest and offered him a look of absolute chilling indifference. As Marcus took one more highly aggressive step toward us, the heavy, dark-tinted windows of the black SUV parked directly behind me rolled down smoothly. Four massive, heavily armed men in immaculate black suits stepped out of the shadows smoothly and silently, forming an impenetrable wall of muscle between me and my ruined husband. The grand ballroom of the convention center buzzed with the low, heavy hum of immense power. Thousands of military contractors, four-star generals, and tech investors filled the velvet-lined rows. Bright, glaring spotlights cut through the darkened room, illuminating the massive main stage of the National Defense Tech Expo. This was the most important event of the year in our industry. Every major news network was broadcasting the keynote presentation live to millions of viewers nationwide. I sat quietly in the third row, dressed in a sharp, tailored black suit. My Sterling Corporation security badge rested heavy and solid against my chest. Victoria sat 2 seats away, her posture perfect, her dark eyes fixed on the empty podium. The air was thick with anticipation, but my heart beat with a slow, steady rhythm. The battlefield was set. The heavy velvet curtains parted, and Marcus walked out onto the stage. Chloe followed close behind him. The applause from the crowd was polite, but I could immediately see the cracks in their polished armor. Marcus was wearing his custom navy suit, but it hung slightly wrong on his shoulders. He was sweating. Under the harsh stage lights, a thin sheen of perspiration glistened on his forehead. He gripped the edges of the acrylic podium with white knuckles. Chloe stood a few feet back, her usual icy confidence replaced by a rigid, terrified stiffness. The unannounced federal raid on their headquarters had clearly broken their spirits. They were bleeding out behind the scenes, and this presentation was their desperate final tourniquet. Marcus cleared his throat and tapped the microphone. He forced a wide, artificial smile that didn't reach his panicked eyes. He launched into his presentation, projecting sleek, high-definition graphics onto the massive screen behind him. He proudly announced their new revolutionary defense software. He called it an impenetrable fortress of code designed to secure the nation's most sensitive military infrastructure. I listened to my own husband confidently sell the exact technology he had stolen from my new employer. He used all the right corporate buzzwords. He promised the generals in the front row that this software would change the face of modern warfare. He spoke about encryption protocols and adaptive security grids, reading off the teleprompter with growing desperation. But I knew the truth. I knew every single line of that code. I had spent weeks in a windowless room, analyzing the very blueprints he was currently displaying to the world, and I knew exactly where he had cut corners. As Marcus wrapped up his pitch, begging the audience for their trust and their multi-million-dollar contracts, the moderator stepped onto the stage. The lights brightened across the massive ballroom. It was time for the open-floor Q&A session. A few polite softball questions came from friendly investors in the front. Marcus answered them quickly, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. He glanced over at Chloe, offering her a shaky nod. They thought they had survived. They thought they had successfully sold the illusion. I stood up from my seat. My heels clicked softly against the carpeted floor as I walked down the center aisle. The camera operators turned their heavy lenses toward me as I stopped in front of the primary microphone stand. Marcus looked down from the stage. The moment his eyes locked onto mine, all the color instantly drained from his face. He looked as if he had just seen a ghost. His jaw dropped slightly, and his hands began to tremble against the clear podium. Chloe took a sharp step forward, her eyes widening in absolute horror. She recognized my Sterling Corporation badge. She knew exactly why I was there. The sprawling ballroom went dead silent. Thousands of people watched the sudden silent standoff between the speaker on stage and the woman at the microphone. I leaned forward. I didn't yell. I didn't let a single ounce of anger or betrayal seep into my voice. I spoke with the calm, absolute authority of a military combat engineer. Mr. Vance, I said, my voice echoing clearly through the massive sound system. You claim your adaptive security grid is impenetrable, but looking at the core architecture you just displayed, it appears you are relying on a continuous feedback loop to authenticate external military commands. Marcus swallowed hard. His eyes darted frantically toward the exit, then back to the audience. He leaned into the microphone, his voice shaking. Yes, that is the proprietary innovation of our system. It ensures constant verification. It ensures a fatal bottleneck, I corrected smoothly, not missing a beat. If a hostile entity initiates a localized rapid-fire sequence of ghost pings against your primary firewall, your continuous feedback loop will attempt to authenticate every single false signal. A low murmur began to ripple through the audience. Several high-ranking military officials in the front row leaned forward, their brows furrowed in deep concentration. The system won't just slow down, I continued, keeping my gaze locked on my husband's terrified face. It will completely overload its own processing matrix. By failing to patch the asynchronous vulnerability in the primary bypass code, your software will effectively tear down its own firewall within 45 seconds of a dedicated attack. You are offering the Department of Defense a multi-million-dollar open door. Marcus stood completely frozen. The silence on the stage was deafening. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked desperately at the teleprompter, but there were no answers written there for a problem he never knew existed. He was a corporate suit playing a dangerous game of engineering, and he had just been checkmated on live television. That is highly theoretical, Chloe suddenly interrupted, stepping up to the microphone, her voice shrill and panicked. This is a secure system. We have conducted extensive internal testing. Have you? I asked quietly, my voice ringing with cold precision. Because the initial architectural blueprints for this software drafted by Sterling Corporation over a year ago clearly noted this exact vulnerability. A vulnerability that was meant to be patched before the code was illegally extracted from our servers. The ballroom erupted into chaos. Generals began whispering fiercely to their aides. Investors pulled out their phones, frantically typing messages. The cameras zoomed in closely on Marcus and Chloe, capturing their absolute, unvarnished panic for the entire world to see. Their professional facade was disintegrating in real time. The federal audit was already destroying their finances behind closed doors, but this public intellectual dismantling was the final nail in their corporate coffin. Marcus gripped his hair, completely unable to defend the stolen technology. He was ruined. His reputation, his company, and his entire future were burning to the ground under the glaring stage lights. He looked down at me, his eyes pleading for mercy. He was silently begging me to stop. I wasn't finished. I stepped away from the microphone stand. I walked calmly up the short set of carpeted stairs leading to the main stage. The security guards didn't stop me. They were too stunned by the unfolding corporate disaster. I walked directly up to the podium where Marcus was standing. He shrank back slightly, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The heat of the stage lights beat down on us. The loud murmurs of the stunned crowd echoed through the massive hall. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I pulled out a heavy sealed manila envelope. I held it out to him. Marcus stared at the envelope. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely raise them to take it. He looked into my eyes, searching desperately for some trace of the broken homeless wife he had cast out into the freezing snow. But there was nothing left for him but cold, hard reality. I leaned in close, the microphone picking up the soft, deliberate rustle of the paper as I pressed the envelope against his chest. You might want to read the DNA report on your son. Marcus stared at the thick manila envelope pressed against his chest. He looked at me, a quick, dismissive scoff escaping his lips, trying desperately to project the image of a man in control. He thought I was playing a desperate, pathetic game to embarrass him. He snatched the envelope from my hands, his fingers trembling just enough to betray the absolute terror hiding behind his arrogant smirk. He ripped the paper seal open right there at the clear acrylic podium. The harsh, glaring stage lights illuminated the heavy official documents as he pulled them out. I stepped back, folding my hands in front of me, giving him the space to read the destruction of his own life. First, he looked at the official DNA report. I watched his eyes scan the bold black letters printed on the clinical white page. 0% probability. The confident, smug posture he had carried for years evaporated in a single second. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving his skin an ashen, sickly gray. His mouth opened, but he couldn't seem to pull air into his lungs. He was suffocating on the truth. He shuffled frantically to the second document, the black market adoption receipt, with Chloe's forged signature and the damning offshore wire transfer codes. The heavy paper shook violently in his hands. "What is this?" Marcus gasped. His voice cracked with a high, panicked pitch amplified perfectly by the small microphone still clipped to his expensive lapel. He turned slowly toward Chloe. She had backed away, her designer heels hitting the edge of the massive projector screen. "Marcus!" Chloe whispered, her eyes darting frantically toward the thousands of silent faces in the audience. "Not here. Turn your mic off." But Marcus was entirely broken. The realization that he had thrown away his marriage, his home, and his real biological daughter for a purchased lie short-circuited his brain. The illusion of his powerful legacy shattered into a million jagged pieces. "You bought a baby!" he screamed, his voice raw and echoing like a gunshot through the massive ballroom. "You told me he was mine. You forged a birth certificate to trap me into this marriage." The room, full of four-star generals and elite defense investors, sat in stunned, absolute horror. The silence of the crowd was deafening, broken only by the sharp, rhythmic clicking of press cameras capturing every second of the public meltdown. Chloe's carefully manicured composure completely snapped. The polished tech executive vanished, replaced instantly by a cornered, vicious animal. She lunged forward, grabbing the edge of the podium. "I gave you an empire!" Chloe shrieked right back, her voice echoing through the massive sound system. "You were nothing but a mid-level manager before I pulled you up. You wanted the money. You wanted the legacy. You didn't care where the baby came from as long as it secured your seat at the executive table." Marcus shook his head violently, backing away from her as if she were made of fire. "You're insane," he stammered, holding the forged papers up like a shield. "You orchestrated all of this to merge our assets. You lied about everything." Chloe spun around, her furious gaze abandoning Marcus and scanning the front rows of the audience until it locked onto my mother-in-law. Brenda was sitting frozen in a plush velvet chair, her face buried in her trembling hands. "This is your fault!" Chloe screamed, pointing a shaking finger directly at the older woman. "I paid you to handle her. I paid off your suburban mortgage and funded your country club membership so you would keep Maya quiet and out of our way. You couldn't even do that, you greedy parasite." Brenda shot out of her seat as if she had been physically struck. The elegant, wealthy suburban grandmother act was completely obliterated. "How dare you!" Brenda shrieked, her voice carrying loudly over the heads of the stunned military contractors. Tears streamed through her heavy foundation, leaving dark, jagged streaks of mascara down her cheeks. "You promised me she wouldn't be a problem. You brought a fake child into my house and lied to my face. You ruined my son." "Your son ruined himself," Chloe fired back, her voice dripping with pure venom. "He stole the code because he was too incompetent to build it. He drained her bank accounts. Don't stand there playing the innocent victim when you happily cashed my checks to perjure yourself in family court." The entire toxic foundation of their lives was imploding in real time. They were violently tearing each other to pieces, exposing every bribe, every stolen dollar, and every ounce of fraud to the very government officials they were trying to secure a contract from. I stood quietly near the edge of the stage, my posture straight, relying on my military discipline to keep me perfectly grounded. I didn't have to yell. I didn't have to throw a single punch. I just watched the fire consume the house of cards they had built. Suddenly, the heavy brass-studded doors at the far back of the massive expo hall swung open with a resounding heavy crash. The chaotic screaming between the stage and the audience died instantly. A team of federal agents dressed in dark, sharp suits with golden badges, clipped prominently to their belts, marched purposefully down the center aisle. The crowd of investors and generals parted like the Red Sea, stepping back to give them a wide, clear path. The agents didn't look at the stunned audience. They didn't pause for the flashing press cameras. They walked with absolute terrifying authority directly toward the main stage. The Department of Defense audit was officially complete, and the results were devastating. Chloe took a stumbling step backward, her eyes wide with absolute panic. She looked left and right, desperately searching the shadows of the stage for an exit that didn't exist. Marcus simply stood frozen at the podium, the fake adoption papers dropping from his numb fingers to rest on the carpeted floor. The lead federal agent walked briskly up the short set of stairs and stepped onto the stage. He didn't offer a polite corporate greeting. He reached to the back of his belt and pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. "Chloe Sterling," the agent said, his deep voice carrying clearly without the need for a microphone. "You are under arrest for federal corporate espionage, wire fraud, and the illegal trafficking of classified defense materials." Chloe let out a sharp, breathless gasp. She tried to pull her arm away, a final instinct of a woman used to buying her way out of trouble. But the agent was fast and entirely uncompromising. He grabbed her wrist, twisting it smoothly behind her back. The sharp, definitive click of the handcuffs locking around her wrists echoed loudly through the completely silent ballroom. "You have the right to remain silent," the agent continued in a bored, methodical tone, physically turning her around to face the aisle. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Chloe didn't shriek anymore. The terrifying, inescapable reality of federal prison completely drained the fight from her body. The wealthy, untouchable tech CEO was gone. She looked broken, small, and utterly defeated as two armed agents escorted her down the stairs and walked her back through the sea of flashing cameras. I watched her go, feeling a profound, settling peace expand in my chest. The woman who had treated my daughter like a disposable prop was finally facing justice. I turned my attention back to the center of the stage. Marcus was left standing entirely alone. The massive digital screen behind him still displayed the stolen software architecture, a glowing monument to his absolute ruin. His fake company was gone. His bank accounts were frozen by the Department of Justice. His wealthy wife was on her way to a federal holding cell. And the son he thought was his legacy was a stranger purchased on the black market. He slowly turned his head to look at me. The arrogant smirk, the condescending sneer, the cruel confidence that he had worn like a weapon for 3 years was completely gone. He was nothing but a hollow, terrified shell of a man, his eyes filled with thick, desperate tears spilling over his eyelashes and tracking down his pale cheeks. He took a shaky, uneven step toward me. His knees buckled completely under the crushing weight of his new reality. He collapsed directly onto the hard stage floor, the sound of his knees hitting the wood echoing in the quiet room. The cameras from the press pool flashed relentlessly, bathing him in a harsh, bright light, capturing every agonizing second of his public humiliation. He looked up at me from the floor, clasping his trembling hands together. His chest heaved with desperate, pathetic sobs that shook his entire frame. "Maya, please!" he begged, his voice carrying clearly over the snapping camera shutters, pleading for a mercy he never showed me. "I'm so sorry. I lost everything. Please, Maya, forgive me." I looked down at the man kneeling on the hard wooden stage. Flashbulbs exploded around us like a violent lightning storm, capturing every angle of his absolute humiliation. Marcus's hands were clasped together, his knuckles white with desperate tension. His expensive, custom-tailored navy suit was wrinkled and dark with nervous sweat. He was sobbing loudly, begging me in front of 4-star generals and federal agents for a forgiveness he did not deserve. I searched my heart for a flicker of pity. I waited for the familiar, suffocating ache that used to follow his apologies when we were married. I expected some small part of me to mourn the man I once thought was my safe harbor. But as I stared into his red, tear-filled eyes, I felt absolutely nothing. The space in my chest where my love for him used to live was completely peacefully empty. The betrayal had burned it all to ash, and the wind had carried it away. "Please, Maya!" He choked out, his voice cracking violently. He reached a trembling hand toward the hem of my tailored skirt. I lost everything. I have nothing left. I took a single deliberate step backward. I didn't yell. I didn't offer a final dramatic speech. I didn't say a single word to him. I didn't need to. I simply turned my back, stepped down from the stage, and walked down the center aisle of the quiet ballroom. I walked out into the crisp, cool night air, leaving my past completely behind me. The justice system is notoriously slow, but when it is fueled by a massive federal audit and irrefutable digital evidence, it moves with a terrifying, crushing precision. Over the next 6 months, the fraudulent empire Marcus and Chloe had tried to build was systematically dismantled brick by stolen brick. I sat in the front row of the federal courthouse gallery on the morning of Chloe's sentencing. The large room smelled of old wood and polished leather. Evelyn sat right beside me, her posture perfect, quietly watching her hard work come to fruition. Chloe wasn't wearing designer cashmere or $1,000 heels. She was dressed in an oversized faded orange jumpsuit. Her perfectly highlighted hair was flat dull and tied back with a cheap elastic band. She stood before the judge, her shoulders slumped, stripped of all her arrogant power. The federal judge didn't care about her historical wealth or her carefully practiced weeping apologies. He looked down from the bench with utter disgust. He spoke at length about the severity of her corporate espionage, the malicious forgery, and the sheer audacity of her fraud. He struck his heavy wooden gavel, ordering her entire estate seized to pay full restitution to Sterling Corporation. Every hidden offshore account, every luxury sports car, and every piece of diamond jewelry she had flaunted was instantly stripped away. He sentenced her to 10 years in a federal penitentiary. As the armed bailiff stepped forward and clamped heavy steel handcuffs around her wrists, Chloe looked back over her shoulder at the gallery. Her eyes met mine. They were hollow, haunted, and deeply terrified. The woman who had tried to buy my family was now entirely bankrupt, facing a decade behind steel bars. With Chloe sitting in federal prison and their merged company completely liquidated by the government, Marcus was left with absolutely nothing. He was formally and publicly disbarred, his professional reputation permanently radioactive in the corporate world. With his bank accounts frozen and his luxury home seized by the feds, he had only one place left to go. He was forced to move back into his mother's house. But even Brenda's sanctuary was rapidly crumbling around them. Brenda had built her entire identity on suburban prestige. She thrived on country club luncheons, neighborhood gossip, and the illusion of an immaculate wealthy family. But secrets that explosive do not stay hidden in a quiet, affluent neighborhood. The details of her blatant perjury in family court, her involvement in the corporate fraud, and the horrifying truth about the black market baby became the ultimate local scandal. Evelyn told me the details over coffee one morning. Brenda had walked into her favorite upscale grocery store on a Sunday, expecting the usual warm, deferential greetings from her social circle. Instead, women she had known for over a decade actively turned their shopping carts down different aisles to avoid looking at her. When Brenda tried to sit at her usual patio table at the local country club, her so-called best friends simply stopped talking. They picked up their iced teas, grabbed their designer purses, and walked away without saying a single word. The social exile was immediate and absolute. Brenda was entirely alone, trapped as a pariah in a house of shattered illusions. Without Marcus's income, the pristine house began to fall into disrepair, the lawn overgrowing and the paint peeling. Marcus was relegated to Brenda's cramped, damp, unfinished basement. The man who used to demand perfection, who believed he was destined to run boardroom empires, was now surrounded by cold concrete walls and dusty boxes of old holiday decorations. It was a freezing Tuesday evening, exactly 1 year after he had thrown me out into the biting winter snow. Rain beat heavily against the tiny ground-level basement window, leaking a steady freezing draft into the room. Marcus sat on a worn, sagging floral sofa, a cheap, scratchy blanket pulled tightly over his shoulders to fight the chill. His face was unshaven, his eyes dark and sunken from months of regret. He aimed the television remote at a small, outdated screen, mindlessly flipping through the channels. He was just trying to drown out the muffled sound of his mother weeping upstairs in the kitchen. He stopped on a premier national business network. The channel was broadcasting a live exclusive interview from a sleek, brightly lit corporate office. Marcus froze. The plastic remote slipped from his numb fingers, clattering loudly onto the hard concrete floor. He stared at the television screen, his breath catching painfully in his throat. I was sitting gracefully across from the network's top financial anchor. I was wearing a stunning, perfectly tailored ivory suit. My natural hair was styled flawlessly. I looked incredibly healthy, confident, powerful, and completely at peace. The bright blue graphic at the bottom of the screen displayed my name in bold letters, followed by my new official title, Chief Operating Officer of Sterling Corporation. Victoria had officially promoted me that very morning. Marcus watched in absolute paralyzed silence as the interviewer asked me about my vision for the company's future. He watched me speak with calm, undeniable authority about global security infrastructure and corporate integrity. The anchor asked me how I had managed to navigate such a massive transition in the defense tech world. I smiled warmly at the camera, speaking about the power of resilience and the importance of surrounding yourself with trustworthy allies. I wasn't the broken, discarded, homeless woman he had tried to erase. I was a titan in the exact industry he had been permanently exiled from. In the damp, freezing basement, Marcus pulled his knees tightly to his chest. He stared at the glowing screen as hot, bitter tears spilled over his eyelashes, tracking slowly down his pale cheeks. He finally realized the sheer, staggering magnitude of the empire he had willingly thrown away. He had traded a brilliant, loyal partner and a beautiful daughter for a complete bought lie. The next morning, the sun was shining brightly over my new neighborhood. I stood in the massive, state-of-the-art kitchen of the home I had purchased entirely on my own. It was a beautiful, sprawling, mid-century modern house, surrounded by tall, protective oak trees and secured by top-tier surveillance. Zara was sitting happily in her high chair, babbling and laughing as she smashed a piece of fresh banana into her tray. She was growing so fast, surrounded by an environment of absolute peace and stability. I smiled, leaning down to press a long kiss to the top of her head, breathing in the sweet, comforting scent of her baby shampoo. We were safe. We were thriving. I walked out the front door and down the long, private driveway to the heavy iron mailbox. The crisp morning air felt amazing in my lungs, a stark contrast to the suffocating chill of my past. I gathered a small stack of mail and carried it back inside, dropping the envelopes onto the polished marble kitchen island. I sifted through the pile casually. An electric bill, a glossy magazine catalog, a beautiful gold-foiled wedding invitation from one of my lead security engineers. Then my hand paused. Sitting at the very bottom of the pile was a thick, heavy envelope. The paper was cheap and slightly wrinkled, as if it had been handled too many times by nervous, sweating hands. There was no printed professional label. There was only rushed, frantic, shaky handwriting in dark blue ink. I stared at the return address scrawled desperately in the top left corner. It was Brenda's suburban address, and the name written directly above it belonged to Marcus. I picked up the thick envelope, feeling the heavy, undeniable weight of the pages folded inside. The winter sun poured through the large, arched window of my home office, casting a warm golden glow across my mahogany desk. Outside, thick white flakes of snow drifted lazily through the air, settling gently onto the manicured lawn. I sat back in my plush leather chair, a steaming mug of dark roast coffee resting near my elbow. The house was blissfully quiet save for the soft, rhythmic hum of the central heating. In the center of my desk sat the thick, heavy envelope I had pulled from my mailbox the day before. The cheap paper was crumpled at the edges, stained with what looked like dried watermarks or perhaps tears. The return address scribbled frantically in the top corner belonged to Brenda's cramped, unfinished basement. I picked up the envelope, feeling its weight in my hands. A year ago, a letter from Marcus would have sent my heart hammering against my ribs. It would have triggered a flood of panic grief and suffocating anxiety. But today, my pulse remained perfectly steady. My hands didn't shake. I felt absolutely nothing but a mild, distant curiosity. I slid a brass letter opener beneath the flap and pulled out the thick stack of lined notebook paper. The handwriting was erratic, slanting desperately across the pages. I didn't read it carefully. I just skimmed the paragraphs, catching the pathetic, repetitive phrases that covered the sheets. He wrote about how sorry he was. He wrote about how Chloe had manipulated him, how he had been blind to the truth, and how he had lost everything that ever mattered. He begged for my forgiveness. He pleaded for a second chance, promising that he had changed, that he would spend the rest of his life making it up to me and Zara. It was the desperate, pleading letter of a man who had finally realized the staggering magnitude of the empire he had thrown away. He wasn't mourning the loss of his family. He was mourning the loss of his comfort, his pride, and his stolen legacy. I didn't feel the need to read the final page. I didn't need to hear his justifications or absorb his guilt. I had spent 3 years of my life shrinking myself to accommodate his ego, and I absolutely refused to spend another single second entertaining his empty excuses. I turned in my chair and switched on the heavy-duty paper shredder sitting beside my desk. The machine hummed to life with a low mechanical growl. Without a single ounce of hesitation, I fed the pages into the silver slot. I watched calmly as the sharp metal teeth caught the cheap notebook paper, pulling his desperate apologies down and shredding them into tiny, unreadable ribbons. When the final page disappeared, I fed the envelope in right behind it. I turned off the machine, the silence rushing back into the sunlit room. I didn't need his closure. I had already found my own. I stood up, smoothing the front of my soft cashmere sweater, and walked out of the office. The hardwood floors of my beautiful mid-century modern home felt solid and grounding beneath my bare feet. I had purchased this house entirely on my own, relying on my salary as chief operating officer and my own impeccable credit. No hidden shell companies, no secret bank accounts. Every single brick belonged to me. As I stepped into the sprawling living room, the comforting scent of roasted garlic and fresh rosemary drifted from the kitchen. A fire crackled warmly in the massive stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows against the plush cream-colored rug. Sitting in the center of that rug was my greatest triumph. Zara let out a bright, musical giggle as she stacked a set of wooden blocks, clapping her tiny hands together when the tower wobbled but stayed upright. She was a healthy, vibrant, fiercely intelligent toddler. Her dark curls were pulled back into 2 neat puffs, and her dark eyes shone with absolute security and joy. I knelt down beside her, wrapping my arms around her warm, sturdy little body. She leaned back against my chest, nuzzling her soft cheek into my neck. I breathed in the sweet, powdery scent of her skin, feeling a profound, overwhelming wave of gratitude wash over my soul. She had absolutely no memory of the freezing parking lots or the dingy, smoke-stained motel room. She would never remember the sterile fluorescent lights of the county visitation center or the way her mother had to suppress her tears just to survive an hour in enemy territory. To Zara, the world was a safe, warm, and beautiful place. She knew nothing but the absolute certainty of my unconditional love. I pressed a long, lingering kiss to the top of her head, silently promising that she would never know the coldness of betrayal. "Look at you," a smooth, familiar voice called out from the entryway. "Building skyscrapers already. She takes after her mother." I looked up to see Victoria walking into the living room, brushing a few stray snowflakes from the shoulders of her elegant wool coat. She was holding a large, beautifully wrapped bakery box in one hand and a bottle of expensive red wine in the other. I stood up, grinning broadly as I walked over to hug her. The embrace was firm and genuine. Over the past year, Victoria had completely transcended the role of my employer and mentor. We had fought side by side in the trenches of corporate warfare, dismantling an empire of lies together. In the aftermath of the ashes, she had become the fiercely loyal chosen family I had always deserved. "You are right on time," I said, taking the bakery box from her hands. "The roast is almost out of the oven. Please tell me you brought the chocolate ganache." "I never show up to Sunday dinner empty-handed, Maya." Victoria laughed, slipping off her coat and hanging it in the hall closet. "Evelyn might drop by later for dessert too. She just wrapped up a massive deposition and said she desperately needs the sugar." The mention of my terrifyingly efficient lawyer brought a fond smile to my face. The brilliant, ruthless women who had helped me reclaim my life had become regular fixtures in my home. We didn't share blood, but we shared a deep, unbreakable bond forged in the fires of survival. Victoria knelt on this rug, letting Zara enthusiastically show off her wooden blocks. Watching the powerful, imposing CEO of a multi-million-dollar tech firm coo over a toddler's building skills filled my chest with an incredible settling warmth. This was my family now. There was no historical gaslighting, no insidious microaggressions, and no conditional affection. There was only mutual respect, honesty, and unwavering support. I walked into the massive state-of-the-art kitchen to check on the dinner. I pulled the heavy roasting pan from the oven, setting it carefully on the pristine quartz countertop. The house felt incredibly alive, vibrating with the sounds of Victoria's deep laughter and Zara's happy babbling. I poured myself a glass of water and walked slowly toward the floor-to-ceiling windows lining the back wall of the dining room. I wrapped both hands around my glass, looking out at the sprawling, snow-covered landscape of my backyard. The snow was falling heavier now, painting the world in a stark, blinding white. It looked exactly like the bitter howling storm that had whipped against my face on the freezing Tuesday afternoon I was cast out. I remembered the physical agony of my healing body. I remembered the sheer suffocating terror of standing at that icy bus stop with only $50 to my name, clutching my newborn daughter against my chest. They had thrown me to the wolves, fully expecting me to freeze to death in the shadows. But as I stood in my beautiful home listening to the joyful sounds of my chosen family in the next room, the contrast was absolute. The cold could no longer touch me. The fire they had tried to burn me with had only forged my armor. I took a slow, deep breath of the warm, rosemary-scented air. I didn't just survive the winter storm. I commanded it. And in doing so, I had built a life far more beautiful, far more powerful, and far more unbreakable than the one I had lost.